I'm Emma Abbott, 32 years old. I work as an investment consultant and have earned strong trust from my clients. My career is going well, and I'm about to get married. My fiancé, Bob Shamrock, is the sales director at a major real estate company, the Shamrock Group, and is set to be the next successor. However, Bob hasn't been involved in any of our wedding preparations lately, and now it's the day of the wedding. Right after we made our entrance, the doors of the venue swung open, and Jessica walked in with the child.
Everyone, listen up.
Her loud voice echoed throughout the room. What? Jessica. Jessica is my childhood friend from preschool, and I had invited her to the wedding. What's going on, Jessica?
This child is Bob's and mine,
She said, holding the child in her arms. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The entire room fell silent, and the guests froze. Jessica, what are you talking about? Don't joke at a time like this.
This is no joke. Bob and I have been in love, and this child is Bob's.
Jessica, accompanied by her young child, made a sudden declaration.
Emma, marrying him is pointless.
I looked over at Bob to see how he would respond, and he quietly nodded without denying a word of what she said.
Well, now that it's out, nothing I can do about it, right? That's how it is.
Why? The venue erupted in chaos as guests began murmuring. In the midst of the confusion, I realized everything. Yet, despite the humiliation, I calmly said, this engagement is over. I started to leave the venue, but Jessica and Bob watched me go, laughing hysterically. Just then, the doors of the venue swung open again. A cold air swept through the room, and all eyes turned toward the entrance. Standing there was my business partner and the CEO of the investment fund, Mason Kirk. He stood tall, scanning the room calmly. He wasn't just my business partner. He's someone with significant influence in the business world. What could it mean that he showed up here? Everyone held their breath for a moment.
Who the heck are you? What are you doing here?
This is quite the interesting situation.
Mason slowly began to speak. His voice was low and calm, but it had an intensity that filled the entire room.
Jessica, Bob, you two really put on quite the show.
Mason turned his gaze towards the two of them, but instead of saying anything, he simply shot them a look filled with disdain. Then he started walking slowly toward me. The murmurs in the room gradually quieted down as everyone focused on his every move.
Emma, you've done well to hold it together. Staying calm in a situation like this is no small feat.
Saying that, Mason gently placed his hand on my shoulder.
Now, it's time to fight back.
He smiled at me, then turned his gaze back toward Bob. With Mason's help, I had been digging deep into Bob and Jessica's activities, down to every detail. I straightened up and said, Bob and Jessica, if you thought I was just going to sit back and endure your betrayal, you're dead wrong. Jessica briefly looked surprised, but quickly regained her composure, flashing a mocking smile.
What are you talking about? I haven't hidden anything. In fact, my beauty salon is thriving. I've gained more clients and business is booming.
I stared at her coldly. As a salon owner and influencer, sure, you appear successful. But what about behind the scenes? Jessica seemed a little rattled, but quickly scoffed and raised her voice.
My business is flawless. There's nothing wrong with it. You wouldn't understand how hard I've worked.
Worked hard? I know about your shady business dealings. That remark caused a stir among the people around us. I smirked, and Mason cut in sharply.
We've got all the evidence proving that you've been funding and running your salon with illegal money.
Jessica's face froze, and her eyes began to dart around.
Shady business. What are you talking about? That's a lie, a misunderstanding for sure.
Jessica desperately tried to respond, her voice trembling. However, Mason calmly continued.
You tricked investors into funding your business by feeding them lies about your operations. On top of that, you've been hiding your profits without properly reporting your income. And we have all the evidence.
Jessica's face contorted as she vehemently protested.
What are you talking about? I would never do something like that. There's no way you have any proof. You're trying to set me up.
I quietly pulled out my phone and smiled. Oh, we've got the proof right here. All of it. Want me to show everyone in this room? As soon as I finished speaking, the entire room fell silent. Jessica immediately went quiet, her expression tightening.
No, this can't be. It's a lie.
Jessica muttered in a small voice, her body beginning to shake. Still trying to resist, she spoke up again, her voice still trembling.
It's a lie. It has to be. That evidence must be fake.
Her eyes darted around, and I could see her crumbling inside. All eyes in the room were now on Jessica, and murmurs started spreading. It was clear that no one in the crowd believed her excuses. In recent years, Jessica had built her reputation as an influencer, gaining popularity on social media. Her beauty salon success had largely been fueled by the power of her followers. But the truth behind that success had always been a lie. Jessica, it seems like you've been doing a lot of convenient things as an influencer. Jessica looked surprised for a moment, but quickly put on a smile, pretending to stay composed.
What are you talking about? I have real followers and advertisers trust me. My business is doing great.
She raised her voice, still trying to sound confident. But is that really the case? I took a step forward, locking eyes with her. The truth is, you bought a lot of those followers, didn't you? And you've been lying to advertisers about your inflated follower count. At that moment, Jessica's face stiffened. The color draining from her cheeks and sweat started to bead on her forehead. Still, she forced a smile and replied,
That's impossible. That's just a rumor.
Mason interjected calmly.
A rumor? So, the evidence we've already handed over to your advertisers is just a rumor too?
The moment those words left Mason's mouth, Jessica's face turned pale and her body trembled slightly.
Evidence? No, that can't be. Who would?
If you want the proof, it's right here. I pulled out my phone and pretended to show the screen. We've got everything. The proof you bought followers and deceived advertisers right here.
It's all lies. That evidence must be fabricated.
Jessica shouted with all her remaining strength, but her voice was weak, and no one in the room believed her anymore. The entire room was silent as every guest stared at her. The stares from the crowd were filled with disdain, as if they were witnessing the exact moment when the false world she had built came crashing down. You bought followers with money, and all the ad revenue you earned from that. Now, the truth is going to come to light. And let's not forget, you've also had dealings with the Shamrock Group. I added the final blow, coldly smiling at Jessica. Your time as an influencer is over, starting today. Jessica collapsed on the spot.
No, that can't be. Impossible. Why?
Why, you ask? because everything you built was based on one lie after another. And now, you're paying the price for deceiving advertisers with fake followers.
Jessica shook once again, then crumbled to the floor, unable to stand.
I can't believe this.
That's all she could mutter. The guests stared down at her with cold eyes, and the silence that spread through the room only served to push her further into despair. This was the moment when Jessica's false life completely fell apart. "This is the end of your fake life?" Mason said to me with a smile.
That's right. Anything built on lies will eventually collapse. And now it's happening.
"From this moment on, everything you've been hiding has fallen apart," Mason said calmly, shifting his gaze slowly to Bob and fixing him with a piercing stare. There was disdain in his eyes, and the air around him grew heavy with tension even before he spoke.
Now, it's your turn, Bob. You've been pretty bold yourself.
Mason's cold voice echoed through the room, and the atmosphere grew even more tense. Bob couldn't hide his panic. His eyes darted from side to side.
What are you talking about?
His voice was already laced with fear and anxiety. His hands trembled slightly, and it was clear he was losing his composure. Mason watched him coolly, taking a slow step forward. Everyone in the room waited for his next words.
We have all the evidence that you've been leaking company client information to outsiders, selling out their privacy for money.
At that moment, Bob's face turned pale, and his lips began to tremble. His eyes wavered, and he struggled to form words, but his panic choked them back.
That's impossible. There's no way you have evidence.
Bob raised his voice in protest, but it lacked confidence.
There's no way that exists.
Bob shouted again.
I've just been doing my job. You're trying to set me up? This has to be some kind of misunderstanding.
He stepped toward Mason, trying desperately to show resistance.
Are you trying to ruin my career? There's no way I'm going to let that happen.
But Mason remained unmoved, responding with an even colder tone.
A misunderstanding? Why don't you ask your bosses? They've already seen the evidence.
Mason turned his gaze toward the audience, where Bob's bosses were sitting.
Look at the faces of your bosses. See for yourself what they think.
As Mason coldly delivered his words, Bob's gaze slowly swept the room, finally landing on his bosses' faces. His boss's face was filled with cold anger and disappointment. Seeing that expression, Bob's face went pale.
No, this can't be happening.
He muttered in a hoarse voice, but there was no power left in his words. The stern look on his boss's face was enough to make Bob realize that he had lost everything. Mason continued mercilessly.
You understand why your boss is wearing that expression, don't you? You can't hide your wrongdoing any longer. Everyone here is a witness.
Bob, in a panic, tried to fight back again.
I didn't do anything like that. Leaking client information? That's absurd.
Is it really?
Mason briefly smiled, but it quickly faded, and his cold expression returned.
This is the consequence of your actions, Bob. It's time for you to face them.
Mason's words echoed throughout the room, and a heavy silence fell over the crowd. Bob, now in shock, could only stand there, trembling as he buried his head in his hands. I stepped forward, surveying the confused audience and taking a deep breath. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I deeply apologize for bringing such personal matters into this setting. This was supposed to be a joyful event for all of you to enjoy, and I am truly sorry for ruining it with our private issues. The room remained quiet, and while the guests looked confused, they continued to listen to me. However, if you don't mind, I'd like to take a little more of your time. This is something I believe you should all be aware of. I bowed slightly and began to speak again. I know this must be an unexpected turn of events for all of you, but I hope you can stay with me until the end. Then I turned my attention back to Jessica. Jessica, earlier you said that this child is Bob's secret love child. Is that true? I shot a cold gaze at her as I asked. Jessica looked surprised for a moment but quickly smirked.
Yes, it's true. There was no way I could keep it hidden, so I'm relieved it's finally out in the open.
She answered as if she had won some kind of victory. Is that so? Then why don't you tell us in detail when your relationship with Bob started? I pressed her further, not letting up. Jessica stayed silent for a moment, hesitating, but then tried to maintain her bold demeanor.
It was about 5 years ago when Bob transferred to my area.
I nodded calmly at her answer, though inside, I felt a deep anger rising. 5 years ago. I see. So your relationship began after you reunited. And when was this child born?
2 years ago.
Jessica's eyes flickered nervously as she said it, and the guests in the room began to stir even more. It was clear they were shocked by this revelation. 2 years ago, I repeated, pulling out my phone to double-check the evidence I had gathered. So, 2 years ago, you had a secret child together, and you've been hiding that relationship from me ever since. Bob, sensing the rising tension, raised his voice in protest.
It's all nonsense. The child. We had no choice. When Jessica got pregnant, there was nothing we could do.
You had no choice? Don't even try to use that as an excuse. You had a child with Jessica, kept it hidden, and then proposed to me, promising marriage. Did you ever stop to think how much that would hurt me? Mason calmly interjected at this point.
Now that the secret child has been made public, there's no running from it. We have all the evidence of your relationship. The lies are over.
Bob was at a loss for words. His shoulders slumped.
A secret child. Everyone makes mistakes. I'm sure there are people who would understand.
Everyone makes mistakes. You're really going to try and justify this? What you two did wasn't just a mistake. You intentionally deceived me and continued to lie. If you think brushing this off as something that couldn't be helped makes it okay, then your sense of morality is beyond warped. The room fell silent again, and it was clear to everyone that Jessica's attempts at evasion wouldn't be tolerated. While you were keeping the existence of your secret child hidden from me, I was preparing for our wedding, completely unaware. How miserable were you planning to make me feel? I won't let you or Jessica toy with me any longer. I turned to Mason, and after he gave a quiet nod, I faced Bob once again. Bob, I am officially breaking off our engagement. I will also be filing a lawsuit and seeking damages for your betrayal. The tension in the room spiked as my words landed. You will both pay the price for this betrayal. Your relationship, built on lies and a secret child, ends here, and I intend to take every legal action necessary. These traitors would pay dearly for their actions. Mason, still calm but with a sharp gaze, slowly addressed Bob.
Bob, as the son of the Shamrock Group, you are highly expected to live up to that name. You used that title to do whatever you wanted, didn't you? But those days are over.
Bob's face turned pale as he stared back at Mason.
What are you talking about?
You're aware that my investment fund has been providing significant capital to the Shamrock Group, right?
Mason stepped closer, his piercing gaze fixed on Bob. Bob's eyes widened in realization.
You don't mean.
That's right, Bob. After learning of your misconduct, I've decided you're no longer worth investing in. I'm pulling all of my investments from the Shamrock Group.
As Mason said this, the guests around us gasped in shock, and the room buzzed with murmurs. Everyone knew Mason's investments were a major pillar of support for the Shamrock Group. Bob's knees almost gave out from shock, and his lips trembled.
No, I'm the heir to the Shamrock Group. I'm responsible for the company's future. If you pull your investments, what will happen to our company?
It doesn't matter if you're the heir. If someone like you ends up at the top, I won't invest. That's business, Bob.
Mason's cold words chilled the air in the room even further. Bob's face grew even paler with panic. But it wasn't just the exposure of his wrongdoing that was causing it. I had also invested in the Shamrock Group. Bob knew this and had likely seen our marriage as a business advantage.
Emma, you've invested in the Shamrock Group too, right? That's why, if we married, we would have made the perfect team.
It was clear now that Bob had never loved me. He only wanted my investment. This marriage had been nothing more than a calculated move for his own profit. In that moment, a cold anger welled up inside me. Bob, you were just using me as a business pawn. But unfortunately for you, I've decided to pull all of my investments too. I no longer see any value in you.
My life. Everything is over.
That's right, Bob. This is the result of the path you chose. Secrets, betrayal, and dishonesty. That's what destroyed your future.
Jessica collapsed on the spot, reaching out to Bob in desperation.
Bob, do something. What are we supposed to do now?
But Bob was in no state to respond. At that moment, both his life and the future of the Shamrock Group began to crumble. Unable to stay silent, someone raised their voice. Steve Shamrock stood up and stepped to the front of the room. He is Bob's father. His face was filled with anger, and his sharp gaze was fixed on his son.
Bob, what on earth have you done?
Steve's deep voice echoed through the entire room. With that single statement, the atmosphere grew even more tense. Bob stood frozen in fear, unable to say a word.
Everything you've done has just been revealed. I trusted you and raised you to take over the Shamrock Group. But was all of that a mistake?
Dad,
Bob's voice trembled as he tried to speak, but Shigeyoshi cut him off.
I don't want to hear your excuses. I know all about your corruption, selling client information for money, and now, this affair with Jessica. How much more shame do you intend to bring to our family?
Bob bit his lip hard and looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The stares of everyone in the room were on him, and there was no escape. Steve continued.
I've worked tirelessly to build the Shamrock Group's reputation, but you betrayed that trust and dragged our family's name through the mud. And now, even to Emma.
Steve briefly glanced at me and bowed his head deeply.
Emma, I deeply apologize for the betrayal my son has caused. I cannot and will not overlook this situation.
Steve turned back to Bob, his words now cold and unforgiving.
You no longer have the right to call yourself the heir to the Shamrock Group. As of today, you're dismissed. You are no longer allowed to appear before me again.
Dad, please. Anything but that.
Bob desperately tried to plead with his father, but his words were met with a harsh dismissal.
I have no interest in hearing your excuses. And Jessica, you as well. I am already investigating the illegal activities within your business. Be prepared to face legal consequences.
Jessica was left speechless, crushed by despair. Mason calmly spoke up.
They need time to face the consequences of their actions.
He turned to Bob and Jessica.
You two must now confront what you've done and pay the price.
With that, Mason turned his back and slowly began to leave the room. Bob and Jessica, left behind, could only stand in silence, staring at the ruin they'd created.
Bob, you've lost all your social standing.
You're no longer the heir to the Shamrock Group.
From now on, no one in the company or the industry will trust you with any work.
I've lost everything. My family, my company. I have nothing left.
That's right. You have nothing now. And from this point forward, you'll have to live with that fact, facing the consequences of everything you've done. You will experience just how lonely and powerless you become in society.
The guests in the room watched in silence as Bob collapsed, having lost everything. However, not a single person supported Bob.
This is the end for you, Bob.
Mason said coldly, turning his back slowly.
Please, give me one more chance.
But Mason didn't look back, and without stopping, he said in a cold tone,
There are no second chances for someone who's lost trust. That's how the business world works, Bob.
With those words, Bob collapsed to the floor, as if he had given up on everything. Silence spread throughout the room, and the guests, without a word, could only watch. I stepped forward, looking down at Bob, who had fallen, and said quietly, This is the end of the path you chose. I won't look back anymore, and I won't shed a tear for you. With those final words, I left the room with Mason. The sound of Bob's lamenting voice behind me no longer reached my ears. And as the weeks passed, Jessica and Bob's lives began to unravel rapidly. Jessica's influencer career was the first to fall apart. When the truth spread that her follower count was fake, her social media accounts quickly lost followers. Having lost her credibility, her contracts with advertisers were terminated one after another, cutting off her income. Her social media accounts were shut down, revealing that her glamorous life as an influencer had been a complete lie. As her illegal financial dealings to fund her beauty salon came to light, she found herself entangled in legal investigations. Investors who had backed her business filed lawsuits, and Jessica received a court order to have her assets seized. Her home and salon were soon taken from her, and her life was turned upside down. Former clients and associates looked at her with disdain, and those who had invested in her beauty salon denounced her in court. In the end, the judge ruled for the forfeiture of all her assets and imposed long-term payment obligations.
I've lost everything.
Jessica murmured as she collapsed, consumed by a sense of powerlessness. She had no choice but to admit that her former success had been built on lies. Meanwhile, Bob faced his own downfall, as his misconduct led to his expulsion from the company. All expectations for him as the heir to the Shamrock Group were shattered, and his name became infamous both inside and outside the company. The revelation of his role in leaking customer information caused a major loss of trust in the company. The Shamrock Group plunged into a financial crisis after Mason and I withdrew our investments, and the Shamrock family was left to suffer the consequences. Bob's father completely cut ties with him and was forced to focus on rebuilding the company. Bob, abandoned by his family, was left wandering aimlessly.
What am I supposed to do now?
Bob realized that his life had crumbled and fell to his knees in the street, sobbing. He ended up living alone in a dingy apartment. The glory he once had was gone without a trace, and he was completely isolated from friends, family, and society. No matter how hard he tried to find work, his past misconduct followed him, and no one would hire him.
This wasn't supposed to happen. I was supposed to be the heir to the Shamrock Group.
He whispered to himself in the dimly lit room, tormented by memories of his past mistakes. Jessica, too, had lost everything. All her former friends and followers had abandoned her, and it became widely known that her success on social media had been nothing more than a facade. She was expelled from the beauty industry, with nowhere left to go. Chased by legal debts, Jessica had no choice but to seek low-paying jobs, and the lavish lifestyle she once enjoyed was completely gone. She now lived in a rundown apartment.
How did it come to this?
Jessica lamented her lost past, thinking of the beautiful life she used to have, knowing she could never return to it. As I watched the fate of those two unfold, I felt a deep sense of relief. This is the end of the path you both chose. The path of lies and betrayal they chose had finally come back to haunt them. While my engagement had ended in failure, for me, it was the beginning of something new. The pain caused by Bob and Jessica's betrayal was indeed deep. But overcoming that ordeal gave me a chance to reflect on myself and grow even stronger. As for my work as an investment consultant, it was going incredibly well. My clients trusted me more than ever, and I was handling even larger projects. I had begun focusing on international investment deals, and my presence in the global market had grown significantly. Now, my name was recognized in the industry, and companies and investors were constantly reaching out to me. Amid all this, I decided to take on a new challenge. I was going to start my own business. Using the experience and knowledge I had gained over the years, I decided to establish my own investment fund. But this fund would focus not just on profits, but on sustainable projects that contribute to the environment and society. It was a step toward building the future I believed in. Of course, starting a new path wasn't going to be easy. Many challenges and difficulties lay ahead. But my past experiences had given me strength. The broken engagement with Bob and the betrayal from Jessica taught me how to learn from failure. Now, I was ready to face any headwind that might come my way. Life is short. That's why I'm determined to move forward without regrets, tackling every challenge with full force. With the lessons learned from lies and betrayal close to my heart, I'll continue walking a path of truth. I believe a bright future awaits me.